Old Hollywood sold fantasy, but behind the curtains, power told a very different story. Studios didn't just make movies, they controlled lives. Careers were built in offices, contracts were negotiated in private rooms, and silence was often the price of survival. For actresses, success sometimes came with unspoken expectations tied to men who held absolute authority. These weren't love affairs. They were arrangements, and most of them were never meant to be remembered. Marilyn Monroe. By the time Marilyn Monroe became the most recognizable woman on the planet, Hollywood executives already knew her vulnerabilities better than her talent. Marilyn entered the studio system young, poor, and desperate for stability. At 20th Century Fox, power did not belong to casting directors or agents. It belonged to executives who could end careers with a signature. Monroe's early years were filled with whispered accounts of private meetings, favors exchanged quietly behind office doors, and promises that were never put on paper. These were not romantic affairs. They were transactions disguised as opportunity. Studio executives controlled her contracts, her image, even her medical treatment. When Marilyn resisted, she was punished with suspensions. When she complied, she was rewarded with roles that kept her trapped in the same sexualized persona. The imbalance was absolute. She had fame, but they had control. What makes Marilyn's story particularly disturbing is that these relationships were later reframed as ambition or manipulation, as if she had equal footing. She didn't. The system was built to ensure she never could. By the time Monroe attempted to assert independence, the studio machine had already extracted what it wanted. Her forbidden relationships were not scandalous flings. They were survival strategies in a system designed to consume her. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth's transformation into a Hollywood goddess was not accidental. It was engineered and controlled by a powerful man who doubled as her husband. Edward C. Judson was not a star. He was a producer, promoter, and fixer. He saw potential in young Margarita Cancino and reshaped her completely. Her hairline was altered, her name was changed, her ethnicity was softened, and her career was placed firmly in his hands. Judson controlled Rita's contracts, finances, and daily life. Their relationship was framed publicly as a marriage, but behind the scenes it functioned as ownership. Studio executives tolerated and benefited from the arrangement because Hayworth became a massive asset. Rita's rise was inseparable from her dependence on men who controlled access to studios, directors, and publicity. When she tried to escape that control, she was already too deeply embedded in the system. Her forbidden relationships weren't tabloid affairs. They were quiet power structures, masquerading as romance. By the time Hayworth became a star, she no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to the machine and to the men who ran it. Judy Garland. Judy Garland's relationship with Hollywood executives began before she was old enough to understand what consent meant. Signed to MGM as a child, Judy grew up surrounded by powerful men who dictated her weight, her sleep, her diet, and her emotions. Executives controlled her with pills and threats. As she aged, boundaries blurred. Later biographies and testimonies describe an environment where advances from powerful figures were normalized, and refusing them came with consequences. Judy was not a seductress. She was exhausted, dependent, and emotionally starved. Studio executives positioned themselves as protectors while exploiting her vulnerability. Relationships that should never have existed were quietly tolerated or encouraged by those who profited from her productivity. Her forbidden relationships were not about desire. They were about fear. Fear of suspension, fear of replacement, fear of losing the only identity she had ever known. Hollywood presented Garland as America's sweetheart. Behind closed doors, she was a commodity managed through coercion. The executives who crossed those lines were never punished. Judy paid the price instead. Kim Novak. Kim Novak's relationship with Columbia Pictures boss Harry Cohn was one of the worst-kept secrets in Hollywood. and one of the most feared. Cohn was infamous. He ruled Columbia through intimidation, humiliation, and control. Novak was young, inexperienced, and under contract. The power imbalance was extreme. When she resisted his authority, her career stalled. When she complied, doors opened again. Their relationship was never publicly acknowledged, but industry insiders understood the reality. Cohn controlled her image, her casting, even her romantic life. Novak later described feeling trapped, manipulated, and psychologically exhausted by the studio system. This was not a love affair. It was leverage. Kim Novak was not rewarded for talent, she was tolerated, as long as she remained compliant. When she eventually broke free, her career suffered. Hollywood had no mercy for actresses who escaped executive control. Novak's forbidden relationship stands as one of the clearest examples of how studios enforced obedience through fear. Grace Kelly. Grace Kelly's image was elegance, restraint, and purity, but Hollywood insiders knew a different story. Before becoming a princess, Grace was navigating a studio system where powerful directors and producers held immense influence over casting. Several of her relationships occurred during productions with men who directly controlled her roles. These affairs were discreet, protected, and quietly accepted because Kelly was profitable. What made Grace's situation unique was how successfully the studios shielded her reputation. While other actresses were destroyed by rumor, Kelly was preserved. Her forbidden relationships were managed, hidden, and sanitized for public consumption. She benefited from the system, but only because she played by its rules. Once she married into royalty and exited Hollywood, the machine lost interest. Her past was quietly erased. Grace Kelly wasn't innocent. But she wasn't powerful either. She survived by understanding exactly how far she could go and when to disappear. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor's beauty gave her access. But it was Hollywood executives who decided how far that access went. From her teenage years onward, Elizabeth moved through an industry where powerful producers and studio-connected men surrounded her constantly. Her relationships often blurred the line between personal desire and professional survival. She was pursued relentlessly not just by actors, but by men who controlled budgets, greenlights, and casting decisions. Unlike many actresses, Elizabeth was protected by her box office power. But that protection came with expectations. Studio executives tolerated her affairs as long as she remained profitable. When scandals erupted, they were managed, redirected, or buried. Her forbidden relationships were not secret sins, they were negotiated realities. Hollywood rewarded her defiance because it made money. But the system never stopped asserting control. Elizabeth's independence was always conditional. She was powerful, but never free. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner didn't rise through Hollywood quietly. She rose through men who already owned the industry. Her most consequential relationship wasn't with a co-star. It was with one of the most powerful and unpredictable moguls in America. He had money, influence, and reach far beyond film. Being close to him meant access. Being distant meant consequences. Ava's affairs with powerful men weren't hidden. They were tolerated because they benefited everyone except her. The studio system framed her as reckless, but it relied on her desirability to sell films. What made Ava dangerous wasn't her sexuality. It was her refusal to be owned. And Hollywood never forgave women who refused ownership. Her forbidden relationships kept her employed, but also ensured she would never be trusted. Lana Turner. Lana Turner's relationships were always watched and always judged by the men who controlled her career. She became a star under the MGM system, where producers and executives monitored every move. Romantic involvement with powerful men wasn't optional. It was expected. These relationships shaped her casting, her public image, and her survival within the studio hierarchy. When Lana complied, she was rewarded with roles. When she didn't, her reputation suffered. Executives leaked stories. Rumors were weaponized. The message was clear. Cooperation brought protection. Resistance brought punishment. Her forbidden relationships weren't tabloid thrills. They were part of an unspoken contract, one she could never fully escape. Hollywood never let Lana forget who truly had the power. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford understood Hollywood better than most, and she played the game without illusion. She maintained relationships with powerful studio executives throughout her career, knowing exactly what they offered and what they demanded. Joan didn't pretend these were romances. They were alliances. Her eventual marriage to a studio executive wasn't love. It was consolidation. Power, stability, and control replaced vulnerability. Unlike many actresses, Joan chose proximity to authority rather than submission to it. But even she paid a price. Hollywood resented women who learned the rules too well. Behind the strength was constant paranoia because power could vanish overnight. Joan survived because she aligned herself with the system instead of fighting it. That choice preserved her career, but cost her humanity. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake's rise was rapid, and her fall was intentional. Early in her career, she became involved with influential producers and directors who controlled access to major roles. These relationships elevated her quickly, but they also made her expendable. Once she was labeled difficult, the protection disappeared. Hollywood punished Veronica not for talent issues, but for stepping outside executive expectations. Her forbidden relationships turned from assets into liabilities almost overnight. Executives withdrew support. Roles vanished. Studios moved on. Her career collapse wasn't an accident. It was enforcement. Veronica Lake learned too late that Hollywood only rewards obedience and never forgives independence. Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh's elegance on screen concealed a life shaped by forces far more powerful than public admiration. Her marriage to Laurence Olivier became the dominant narrative, but it often obscured how deeply studios monitored and managed her private affairs. Relationships with directors and producers were not treated as scandals as long as productions remained profitable and prestige remained intact. Executives tolerated behavior that would have ended lesser careers, choosing box office stability over personal well-being. As Leigh's mental health began to deteriorate, warning signs were quietly ignored. She was expected to perform regardless of cost. When her illness interfered with schedules, the same executives who once shielded her withdrew protection without explanation. These were not indulgent affairs driven by excess. They were calculated risks absorbed by a system that valued output over humanity. Leigh's brilliance bought her time, not compassion. Hollywood praised her talent endlessly, but when she became inconvenient, it offered no mercy, only distance and silence. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow's rise was swift, dazzling, and tightly controlled. As MGM's most valuable star, she lived under constant executive supervision. Relationships with producers and studio-connected men were quietly normalized, framed as part of maintaining stability around a lucrative asset. Her public image was polished with precision, while her private life was dissected and managed behind closed doors. Marriages were scrutinized, friendships monitored, and personal boundaries repeatedly crossed. Executives protected her reputation relentlessly, but only because it protected profits. What they did not protect was her health. Illness was treated as an inconvenience rather than a warning. Production schedules continued. Expectations remained unchanged. When Harlow weakened, the system did not slow down or adjust. It simply waited. Her forbidden relationships were not romantic mistakes or reckless choices. They were symptoms of a studio structure that viewed stars as replaceable commodities. Jean Harlow was celebrated intensely, but only as long as she could continue delivering what Hollywood demanded. Loretta Young. Loretta Young's story represents one of Hollywood's most deliberate acts of erasure. Her relationship with a powerful director led to consequences the studio system moved quickly to contain, not for her protection, but for its own. Executives coordinated silence with efficiency. Seclusion, isolation, and narrative control were enforced to preserve the industry's moral image. The public story was sanitized. The private cost was hers alone to bear. Loretta complied because resistance was not an option. Her continued employment depended on discretion. Her silence was rewarded with longevity. Her truth was buried beneath carefully maintained appearances. This was never a forbidden romance driven by passion. It was containment, executed cleanly and without hesitation. Hollywood mastered this process, refining it until damage could be hidden entirely. Loretta Young survived professionally, but only by surrendering ownership of her own story. The system functioned exactly as designed. Clara Bow. Clara Bow entered Hollywood as a phenomenon, vivid, modern, and impossible to ignore. That visibility made her valuable. It also made her vulnerable. Executives, producers, and directors surrounded her constantly, dissolving boundaries until scandal became inevitable. What had once been tolerated was suddenly reframed as excess. When rumors surfaced, studios did not defend her. They redirected blame and withdrew support instantly. Her relationships were weaponized. Private behavior became public accusation. Leaks appeared. Narratives shifted. Clara was no longer an asset to protect. She was a liability to remove. Her downfall served a purpose. It reinforced obedience. It warned others. Visibility without submission would be punished, loudly and publicly. Hollywood didn't simply abandon Clara Bow. It dismantled her reputation, then erased her presence. The industry moved on, leaving her as a cautionary example written between the lines of studio history. Shirley Temple. Shirley Temple's story exposes the most unsettling truth at the core of old Hollywood. Her forbidden relationships were not romantic. They were predatory. As a child star, Shirley existed inside a system run entirely by adults with unchecked authority. Executives, producers, and powerful men controlled every aspect of her life, from contracts to appearances, without meaningful safeguards. Later accounts reveal that disturbing encounters were dismissed, normalized, or ignored by studio leadership. Protection was never the priority. Profit was. Silence was enforced not through threat, but through structure. There was no accountability, only quiet continuation. When Shirley aged out of usefulness, the system disengaged cleanly and without consequence. The empire built on her image remained intact. Her story strips away illusion. Old Hollywood was not powered by glamour or romance. It was powered by control and by the absence of accountability at the highest levels. These relationships were not accidents. They were part of a system that rewarded obedience and erased resistance. Some women survived it, some were destroyed by it, and many carried the cost quietly for the rest of their lives. Hollywood called it business. History called it rumor. But the truth lived somewhere in between, hidden in contracts, sealed files, and stories told far too late.